Today's topic starts with putting Romanticism in the topic or objective box. And then we have two essential questions. The first one is, what historical events influenced Romanticism? And the second one is, how did it impact writing? So on the left side, under topics, the first word that you should put is Romanticism. Romanticism lasted from 1800 to about 1870. Since that's an approximation, I am going to put in parentheses approximately. So just keep in mind that depending on the historians or literary historians that you would learn from, those dates could vary 10, 15, maybe even 20 years on either side of the spectrum. So we're going to go and just include the whole entire spectrum within that time frame. So next, I want to talk about the historical background. So on the left side, under the topics, we're going to put historical background. Romanticism was a literary movement that developed while the Industrial Revolution was happening in the U.S. So on the right side, we're going to put Industrial Revolution. So when you think of the Industrial Revolution or the word industry, probably the first thing that comes to mind is factories, and factories were very important in this process. So we're going to put factories here. Factories produced more jobs. And with more jobs available, that meant that companies needed to hire more people. Because companies were hiring, it created a lot of opportunities for immigrants. And so immigration becomes much bigger than it had previously. With immigration, you have a lot of people coming in from other countries because they want employment and they want better opportunities. But with all those people coming in specifically to work at these factories, it causes a huge population increase. Not only does it increase the population, but it does cause the development of cities. And cities end up being established around industries. So think about that. You have a lot of immigrants coming in to work at factories because there are a lot of jobs available, and this creates good opportunities for these people. They develop cities around the factories and other types of industries that have been established. And think about the fact that these people, they're not coming with lots of money. People don't drive cars yet. If they want to be able to make it to work, they need to live within a walking distance. So this causes people to build and to cram themselves into small amounts of space in areas that are very close to the places that they work. So we call this population density. And that essentially just means that you have a lot of people living in one space. So you have a lot of crowded areas. With the development of the Industrial Revolution, this had both negative and positive impacts on society. But first of all, we're going to talk about how it impacted things negatively in two ways. One, their living conditions, and two, the working conditions. So first of all, let's talk about the living conditions. Keep in mind that primarily this is focusing on people who were working in factories and living in the crowded areas around factories. Okay, so in the living conditions, it was very crowded. And this led to things like privacy issues, for one. I mean, it had a lot of other problems too, but privacy. People lived together in the same building. Some multiple families shared the same apartments. There weren't always walls separating living spaces. So it's crowded. People don't have privacy like they might want. And because of the factories and because of the overcrowding, there is a lot of pollution. And that pollution causes bad air quality, maybe even bad water quality. And then because it's so crowded, diseases spread very quickly. So think of it like this. Say your sister gets a cold. Next thing you know, your mom has a cold. And your mom happens to talk to the neighbor, and then the neighbor gets a cold. And then before you know it, everyone in the building has a cold. And then, like, it just keeps spreading and spreading because people are so closely living so closely together. Another thing that contributed to the spread of diseases was problems with managing waste. So, sewer systems were not well developed. Most of the waste was just tossed out into the open. So, it could be in the streets, and also they didn't have garbage systems well set up either. So, the bad, dirty conditions that people were living in also contributed to the spread of diseases. And as you can imagine, without good sewer systems, without good garbage systems, with lots of pollution, with people being very crowded, it was pretty stinky. While living conditions were bad, working conditions were bad too. Workers dealt with extreme temperatures in the workplace. It could depend on the type of factory they were working in, but keep in mind there was no such thing as central heating or air conditioning back then. So if they were working with boiling water, they were hot all the time. They also dealt with long hours. So even if they were working in the winter and they had to deal with frozen things, they were still working all those hours. And then people were poor, and so they often had their children work as soon as their children were old enough to walk and talk. And so no child labor laws existed yet. And mainly children were working because the wages at factories was really, really low. So people had to have everyone in their family work in order to help them survive. A lot of these things were allowed to happen because there was no such thing as any kind of workers' union. There was nothing to protect people. And because of this, one of the things that women specifically dealt with was harassment. It was not uncommon for a woman to be sexually assaulted by their employers, get pregnant, and then wind up having their own children working for their fathers in these factories. Also, because there weren't any unions, there wasn't any kind of medical coverage or compensation to help people if they got injured on the job or if they got sick. Basically, working in these factories was extremely unsafe. Machinery didn't have the safety features that it has today, so children and adults would lose fingers, arms, legs, feet, and end up having to deal with life as an invalid. And the people they worked for didn't do anything to help them out, so it was possible that becoming disabled at a factory could also mean poverty for the rest of that person's life. Not everything was negative, though. There was some positive impact of the Industrial Revolution. One of the biggest things was the development and improvement of transportation. Transportation was starting to get faster, so one of the things that happened was the development of the train and railroad networks and the steamboat. Also, with all that immigration, there was a much larger workforce, and that workforce was helping to build a much stronger economy and to improve trade because they were producing products so much faster than before, and this was helping make the U.S. a major player in the world economy. Technology was also developing. Think of things like tools that were used in factories. Things like the cotton gin, which helped make processing cotton so much easier, or steam technology that was being used to help with factory machines and other transportation devices. In addition to these things, other inventions were created, such as the telegraph. And this was also the time period when Thomas Edison was working on his own inventions and products. So, how does this impact writing? Well, there are 5 characteristic traits that you can see in writing and philosophy that comes from the Romantic era. The first one that we'll talk about is imagination and escapism. People were struggling. Even though they had these opportunities with these new jobs and an opportunity to live somewhere new, to better their social class, to own property, they still wanted to be able to get away from the harsh conditions of work or even where they lived. For some people, this was easier than others. If you had enough money, one of the ways in which you could get away and escape the harsh realities in which you lived or worked was to take a vacation and go visit the country. But this wasn't a possibility for most people. I mean, you'd have to be able to get off work, and who knows if your boss would keep your job for you. So, even though that was the best way to escape, most people had to read about nature instead. And this is the part where they use their imagination. So, while they couldn't go to some place that had cleaner air or green grass or nice breezes or animals to see, at least they could read about it and they could mentally go there. So, because of this, in the writing that comes from the Romantic era, there are long, long, long descriptions of nature. And that can be really annoying to people today when they read it, if they don't understand that people back then weren't able to get involved with nature the same way that people are able to do so today. Another element of the imagination quality is that people wanted to create a better place. And that process of trying to create a better place had both positive and negative side effects. One of the positive parts was the development of many, many, many inventions. But there was a negative side too. Sometimes there was poor planning for these inventions. Think of the fact that when they developed more jobs in factories, there wasn't good city planning to help house all the incoming immigrants. Things like that. Or the lack of proper sewer systems or waste management. The second characteristic of Romanticism is seeing the common man as a hero. This was a way to rebel against European systems, specifically the social class. In Europe, people were born into their social class. A poor person couldn't just become a king by trying really hard. Traditionally, in stories, this belief that you were born into the social class that you had to live in was reinforced in stories. The heroes in these stories all came from the upper class. Mainly, they were people like kings or knights or princes. You get the picture. But Americans didn't think this way. Part of the whole reason they had left England or France or Spain was so that they could start over and actually change their lives. They finally had a chance to be the kind of people they wanted to be, and this belief shows up in their stories. For Americans and the rest of the world, this is a really important idea. And in the stories that Americans begin to write and tell, it's the first time in literature where you really see average, normal, everyday people turning into heroes. This belief reinforces the positive perspective that people tend to have on humanity during this time period. I mean, think about it this way. America was just made up of tiny little colonies at this time, and they had successfully beaten the world power at the time period, Britain. Like, totally kicked their butts. Separated from Britain and become their own little country. So, of course, they had a lot of positive perspective and belief in what they could accomplish. It was the beginning of the very American belief that no matter where you come from or where you've been, you can be whatever you want to be with a little bit of hard work. The fourth characteristic of Romanticism is individuality. The main goal of this characteristic is to focus on being yourself or being unique. This was important to Americans because they wanted to separate themselves from England and other European groups. They wanted to be their own independent, recognized nation. Americans established their differences in two ways. One thing that they started to do was to value their intuition. This was developed by relying on gut feeling, whereas historically in other European countries, decisions might have been made off of laws or traditions. People in America did things because they felt like they should do them. Another way in which they separated themselves was through the opportunities that they found in exploration. People literally had the chance to go out, take some land, and build a life that they had always wanted to have. The fourth trait of Romanticism is looking to the past for wisdom. This process or belief was really that old things could be used to help create or develop new things. Think of it like a recipe. You could follow the recipe, but then change some of the ingredients in it. So the end product, while it was inspired by something old, is a fair bit different from the original. So in literature, this looked like references to well-known stories or even characters. Think of things like the Cinderella story. Americans would take the plot line of the story but then change the characters to make them American characters or to have the story happen in American locations. So it would seem almost like a brand new story, but it's inspired by an old story. In government or politics, this could happen in other ways. For example, maybe they're inspired by the Roman government system and the British economic system. So they take the best qualities of both systems, combine them together, and create a brand new system that was inspired by two different systems. The fifth quality of Romanticism is nature as a source of spirituality. This quality is a pretty important one, and it is the one that's probably the easiest to see in literature and other things that were created. So, how this impacted things was that people began to believe that nature was a way for people to connect to God or to interact with the spiritual world. They could do this in various ways. One of them was through meditation. Also, they began to believe that anything you needed to learn, you could learn from nature. This made nature a key to knowledge. If you wanted to figure something out, go into nature, observe it, learn from it, and maybe you'll figure things out. So, this drawing, I'm not a great artist, but this is a really important drawing, so you need to copy it down too. Basically, there was a huge transition in the way people viewed nature from when the Puritans were the primary source of literature to when Romanticism began to develop. Puritans had a fear of the forest. For some reason, they believed that the devil lived in the forest. And if you remember, Puritans were so afraid of going to hell that, of course, if they believed the devil lived in the forest, they would want to avoid it. Some of this belief had to do with the idea that Native Americans weren't Puritans too, and the Native Americans had practices that scared them, like dancing around a fire, made them think of witches. However, after generations, like the great-great-grandchildren of these Puritans, they were much more adventurous. They didn't find the forest scary. And they didn't want to think that way anymore, and they kind of swung the opposite direction where they began to believe that nature was how you got to know a little more about God or how you developed some sort of holiness. So you can see that it just took a couple generations for things to switch from one idea to the next.